As we turn to Eastern religions and Hinduism specifically, we see a completely different concept of the way that God manifests. And so we're going to be looking today at the difference between Western monotheism and Eastern polytheism, and what those two ways of thinking and believing involve in terms of their conceptions of what God is. And this is very interesting because it also impacts overall worldview and a number of other things if you extend it out. So as you can see, if you look at Western concepts of God, traditional concepts of God, God is a creator, usually male, residing in the sky, a high God, frequently above creation, and creates things but interacts with his creation in different sorts of ways, either directly through the creation itself or through acts of God, which usually come as a function of faith on the side of the believer. So there is a relationship between God and man, which is very personal, and that is going to also involve the way that we think about Jesus too, a personal savior who has a direct impact on you. This God is frequently depicted, at least this is a Christian art, as a man, depicted as, in the sky. Heaven is his domain, or above, at the very least, above and outside of his creation. Even if he's interacting with it, he is interacting with it from above. So if you think about this, within this conception of God, you get the concept of both a benevolent God, a God that represents everything good, everything that is creative, everything that is to be worshipped. And then, of course, you have Satan and sinfulness. So this whole idea of goodness and badness being separate from one another, separate forces in the world, this monotheistic duality, which is basically a fancy way of saying this idea that good and evil exist in the world, and you have to choose the good. And the way to do that is to believe in God and to have faith in God. And if you don't, you'll fall into the influence of Satan and sinfulness and hell and heaven and hell, another concept of duality, difference. So if you look at this, the monotheistic assumption is that God is a creator, a unified force, but was also the original religion of man. Either it was the original religion of man and it disintegrated, or it emerged after polytheism, so it has to be a better way of understanding things. So there's a lot of assumptions within monotheism that polytheism is sort of, to use a Christian term, it's pagan, it's sort of primitive. It doesn't really speak to the realities of the world. And, if you go to the East, you're going to have a very different view. So what I want you to do if you're watching this video is I want you to stop the video here and I want you to write some things down about this. What are the advantages of a monotheistic view of the divine? How might this help a society? How might it help the believer? So think about those two ways, the social advantages and the individual advantages of the believer. So stop for a minute. Stop the video now and write those down. Brainstorm for 3 to 5 minutes. Once you're done, we're going to compare this now to Hindu polytheism. Now, Hindu polytheism is completely different. Not only does it embrace many forms of God, it embraces those forms in different ways. And so the idea of God is much more embodied in everything. So there's no concept of God exists here and not here. God exists in all things. So this idea of neti, not this, not that. God is not a thing. God is above a particular thing. God is the higher manifestation, either higher in terms of the way in which God operates in the creation, or within ourselves. God is the higher part of yourself. And this idea of non-duality is that all these different forms, all these different God forms are metaphors or symbols for states of being, states of mind perhaps, or even states of creation. So the Alan Danielou article, which is really hard to read, but has some really good stuff in it, which is why I asked you to read it, he makes a number of interesting points, and I'm just going to come to a few of them. He gets this idea that the nature of illusion, or Maya, which is core in the Hindu Upanishads, is represented by the number one. This idea of unity. Things don't really exist in unity. They exist in multiplicity. You're not one person. You have many different aspects to yourself, different personalities even within yourself. So this idea that there's a kind of a unified reality doesn't make sense to Hindus. The same idea in the third quotation, divinity is that in which opposites coexist. So many of the God forms have good aspects and bad aspects. They're not, Vishnu is both a preserver, but also at times can allow things to no longer be preserved. Shiva is both a destroyer of ignorance in ourselves, but also a destroyer of things. It's not all just a good thing. So this idea, I really like his idea of the mental representation of divinity. This is the fourth quote. When we consider an immense number of different gods, when we try to stress their unity. For the number one is, in a way, the number furthest removed from infinity. So if God is infinite, God's forms must be infinite. There must be a whole lot of different ways that God can be represented, because if God is infinite, that has to be true. So this idea of non-duality, God isn't outside of us or inside of us. God is both outside and inside of us. So Daniel, what he's doing is he is arguing against the West. And the West is saying, monotheism is better for any number of reasons. It leads to more unified societies. It leads to a more personal relationship with God. And the monotheistic colonial countries won. So obviously their God must be better. The British God, the American God, the European God defeated the gods of the East. So clearly monotheism is better. Daniel is coming at it more philosophically and saying, not really. If you really think about how God forms are, it's different and better. And he is making the case that Hinduism is a superior way of believing about things. So now what I want you to do is to think about the advantages of a polytheistic view of the divine, some of which I've already outlined. I want you also to think about this socially. Why might a much more broad and inclusive way of looking at God forms be helpful, particularly in a society like India's, which has a lot of diversity in it? So I want you to think about that. And as I asked you to do before, I want you to stop the video here and write down at least 3 or 4 of these things, and maybe go back a little bit in the video and look at what Daniel says, or go back into the reading and get a sense of it too. Now, to give you some examples of how Hinduism defines God forms, not only in terms of murtis, which are, you see on the right, anthropomorphic objects. It's a fancy way of saying God forms in the forms of human beings, whether men or women. The murtis tend to have a huge range. You have female and male. You have old and young. You have essentially almost as many God forms and murtis as you have Hindus. There are just thousands and thousands of depictions, even of individual gods. So you have God as a form and a sculpture, for example. You have God in the form of sound, as we saw with the Om mantra. So mantras, sacred sounds, are also forms of God, because they carry sound and they carry meaning, and so you can think about a beautiful song, for example, could be an aspect of God, and Hindus certainly look at it that way. So you also see yantras, and so if you've ever seen a mandala, these yantras are basically geometric forms. And if you're wondering what that swastika is doing there, that is the Aryan form of perfection. So it's a symbol of perfection, and so that symbol of perfection is actually a symbol of God, which Hitler, of course, perverted, switched in its orientation, made it also about the symbol of perfection in a much more perverse way. To which a Hindu would say, aha, see, good and bad are interlinked. They just need to just take something good and you look at it through the frame of ignorance and you've got something bad. And that's neti neti. That's not this nor that. And I think that's a really great way of thinking about it. So look at this whole system. You've got God forms, not only in terms of forms of gods, but you also, if you look over on the left, and Sai Baba of Shirdi was a teacher and a healer. He is also going to be deified. So he's a person. So you have the deification of people, great teachers and spiritual guides. So you have on the left, you have God forms like the one on the right, which are actual God forms, but in human form, sounds and yantras. So many, many different ways to recognize God's multiplicity. Finally, and I think we've already looked at this once, but it's worth coming back to. Western religion is historical, meaning because it's historical, it tends to be linear. It goes from one place to another. The Bible is very much the story of the relationship between man and God. In the Old Testament, it's the relationship between originally Abraham and God, ultimately leading to Moses and the Ten Commandments. The law gets provided by God. And then, of course, in the New Testament, it's going to be the history and story of Jesus, the development of the church by Paul, that this is all going to be part of it. So the doctrine, the belief system comes through the prophets, and it is embodied in people who give this truth. And what's interesting about this is you have people delivering doctrine in Hinduism too, but it's not unified. The spiritual teachings are all over the place. So the laws aren't something that are given to you. The laws are something you have to kind of intuitively find through living your life. So it's a very different way of looking at things overall. This other idea that religious aspiration is mysterious and unknowable, God, it remains a sort of a mysterious thing, and that's why you have to have all of these different manifestations and aspects, because fundamentally it's not really a knowable thing. So again, the no human founder, the idea of Sanatana Dharma, which you've already talked about in Hinduism, cosmic truth, is different from the truth that's handed down by God. It's much more distinct in the Western tradition. You have laws, you have teachings, you have an orthodoxy. And orthodoxy means you have a teaching that everybody accepts as the right teaching. Whereas in Hinduism, and this is probably the most important, there's no such thing as an orthodox teaching. There's no such thing as a right message. Every message has its validity. And so what this means is, of course, that Western religions are going to divide along these beliefs about, okay, what's the right sacrament? That's basically what Protestants and Catholics disagree on. Can you just have baptism and communion, or do you have to have all of the other 5 sacraments? So it leads to divisions along the lines of belief, and that's the weakness of Western religion, is that it tends to divide. And just look at Christianity, Orthodox, Catholicism, Protestantism, and then of course all the divisions in Protestantism. You have hundreds of them. That's a very Western thing. In the East, in Hinduism, everything gets absorbed into Hinduism. So the universalism is the great example of this. When we look at Buddhism later in the course, you'll see that Buddha goes off and founds his own religion, and the Buddhists think of themselves as something different. But all that happens with Hindus is they say, oh, well, Buddha was another teacher, and he's just leading to another form of truth. So we'll just absorb that right into our Hinduism. So you could make an argument from a Hindu perspective that everybody's a Hindu, no matter what you believe, you're a Hindu, because if you're in some ways shooting for some understanding of a larger truth or an understanding of God, well, you're a Hindu. Obviously, Westerners don't look at it that way. So what I want you to do now, after all of this, it's a lot of information in a short time, is to think about what about Hinduism is appealing. What in all of these things, what are the aspects of this philosophy and religion that are worth considering, even if you're a devout Christian or a heavily Western believer, as all of us are, not necessarily believers, but at least in the Western tradition. What does Hinduism have to offer us? And I would suggest you write paragraph and think about that in a little bit more depth.